Hello, here's Gio. What name comes to your mind when you hear the word wealth? Bill Gates? Abramovich? Scrooge McDuck? Good options, but there's a better one. Today we'll tell you about someone who was 5 times richer than Bill Gates and who's still considered the richest person in history, although he only lived 100 years ago. Please welcome the great and terrible John Rockefeller, the shark of American business from the times of wild capitalism, the major oil tycoon in history, monopolist, the man whose name becomes synonymous for the secret world government and unscrupulousness. For some people, Rockefeller is a symbol of the American dream, a good example of how a person can climb out of poverty only with the help of his own talent and intelligence. And for others, he's a pure evil, a slave driver, a political intriguer, and a reptilian. Seriously, just take a look at this photo. On YouTube, you can find a lot of information about his life, although it's either a short summary from Wikipedia or a conspiracy nonsense. Today I'll try to look at Rockefeller's life objectively and tell you all about his ups and downs. It's always interesting to get to know how a person thinks, who's in his early age made a promise to himself to earn $100,000 and live to 100 years. And more than that, he almost fulfilled these both promises.
Hello?
President Kennedy died at approximately...
John Rockefeller was born in 1839 in a small town near New York. His family was quite unusual. The mother of the future billionaire was a devout Protestant. She raised her children in a strict Christian way and taught them to be thrifty and merciful. But the dad couldn't be called a decent family man. He worked as anyone from a lumberjack to a loan shark, and then became famous throughout the state as a fraud selling fake medicine. He didn't spend a lot of time with the kids and was rarely at home in general. Sometime later, he was accused of rape. He fled to Canada and married a second time. He didn't consider it important to divorce his first wife and became a bigamist. In a nutshell, the dad was a real piece of work. Young Rockefeller didn't like his dad and took after his mom. He was a purposeful and silent introvert, but the business acumen was definitely inherited through the parental line. The dad never spoiled the children, and since childhood taught them to rely on themselves and learn to earn money. He almost never gave children anything for free. Wanna have some candy? Pay for it. Wanna get money? Wash up. He actually taught the kids the rules of trade. When John grew up, it was his father who gave him money to start his own business. And besides, it was a loan at interest. By the way, you can often hear from conspiracy theorists that the Rockefellers are rich because they are Jews, or that they're Jews because they are rich. All rich people are Jews, right? But in fact, the Rockefeller family is rooted in Germany, and the mother of the future billionaire was Scottish. But let's come back to our growing business genius. Was it even possible to discern the future magnate in that withdrawn boy? Well, probably yes. Unlike his peers, John knew the value of money since childhood, and even then strived to earn money. Here are 3 facts that everyone retells about the young entrepreneur. He started his career as a businessman at the age of 7. He was buying candies in bags and selling them by the piece to other children, even siblings. When John grew up, he started running a more serious business. He took turkey chicks, fattened them, and sold them to farmers. And finally, the best idea of his young entrepreneur mind was to lend a small amount of money at interest. You'd say nothing new? But how many of you earned at least something at that age? But Rockefeller also had another important feature, the ability not only to earn money, but to count as well. He bought a ledger and wrote down the income and expenses there. Rockefeller kept his notebook until old age as a kind of talisman. Considering all this, we can conclude that all the future adventures of Rockefeller were in fact carefully planned ones and never failed. Rockefeller didn't believe in luck. he believed only in hard work. After high school, John goes to college to study to be an accountant, but at some point, a brilliant thought comes to his mind, which I'm sure also comes to many modern students' minds. Why should I study for several years when there are courses around the corner where I can study the same thing in 3 months? Having decided it was the same thing, he drops out, finishes his courses, and starts looking for his dream job. The 16-year-old Rockefeller dreamed of working as an accountant. Not the greatest dream for a teenager, but look where he got him. He ends up finding a position as an assistant accountant in a small company with a salary of 50 cents a day. And this turns out to be his first and last job as an employee. Rockefeller refused to work for a boss when it wasn't mainstream yet. But even in this position, he didn't daydream about wealth, but kept working hard. And this work was so successful that his salary was doubled in 3 months. A year later, it tripled. The company's owners quickly discerned a talented manager in this young guy and offered him a position as a manager for an incredible amount of money, $600 a month. By the way, the average salary in the US back then was around $50, and Rockefeller wasn't even 20 years old yet. Who would refuse such a gorgeous offer? That was a ticket to a prosperous life indeed. But John wasn't happy about the offer. More than that, he got indignant and left the company. He knew clearly that the former manager having the same position had a salary of $2,000. So on the one hand, the owners of the company are great for discerning the talent of the young accountant, and on the other, they are boobies. They wanted to save money, but as a result, they only lost a valuable employee. And the world received a greedy entrepreneur who was ready to act. The work experience gave him not only the faith in his abilities, which actually was in abundance already, but one more valuable knowledge. Cargo transportation rates in those days were strictly regulated by the government and couldn't be changed. But it turned out that a good conversation with the right people could actually change pretty much everything, even the fixed rates. And this discovery became one of the main trump cards in Rockefeller's future business. So John is 19 and he doesn't have a job but an $800 capital. What should he do? Where should he invest? Suddenly, by a lucky accident, he finds out that his former college classmate Morris Clark is looking for a partner to set up a business. And Rockefeller decides it's a good idea. He takes out a loan from his father and starts his own company. And that was a good start. For a couple of years, the company was engaged in trading almost everything in the world: meats, cigarettes, textiles, and so on. Rockefeller's accounting experience made itself felt, and things started picking up. The investments were paid off during the first year, and for the second year, they earned more than $17,000. Then the Civil War broke out and it ruined many enterprises. But Rockefeller's business, on the contrary, was only picking up. His company consistently received military orders and grew rich. By the way, there's an opinion that Rockefeller believed that money is money, so he sold goods to all the warring parties. Actually, it wasn't like this. First of all, he had enough orders from the Northern States Army. And second of all, Rockefeller himself was a fierce opponent of slavery and voted for Lincoln, and his brother served as a volunteer at the front. In general, in the 2 years, the company's profit has grown so much that the partners began to think where else they could invest their money. And then they saw oil. Now we need to make it clear. It was the 60s of the 19th century. Oil was something confusing for most people. They just learned how to extract it from whales and just figured out why it is needed at all. Whale oil served as the main source of illumination at that time, but it had served flaws. It shone dimly, cost a lot, smelled bad, and suddenly the world has almost run out of whales. And when the first oil to kerosene distillation plant appeared in the United States, the new lamp fuel quickly replaced whale oil. And then an oil production boom began in the USA, which in terms of mass could be compared with a gold rush. Thousands of venturers rushed to start their own business in the hope of making a fast buck. The prices were unsteady. Someone managed to make money, someone lost everything. Everything was aggravated by the lack of well-considered legislation. In fact, the oil didn't belong to anyone, neither the state nor the owner of the land where it was found. Therefore, those who managed to find some oil tried to make the most of it until competitors invaded and poked at a number of their own oil derricks. Well, the situation was nearly the same as the one we had with cryptocurrency 3 years ago. Rockefeller decided to invest his money in this chaos by building his own small oil plant. It was not a large investment. At that time, it was possible to build a plant for just $1,000, and a few people were enough to maintain it. At first, the prices for oil were so high that businessmen paid off all their expenses. Should we throw away half of the oil? Okay, we'll just throw it into the river. Are the shipping rates incredibly expensive? Whatever, the profit is still high anyway. A factory makes poor quality kerosene. We couldn't care less. People will buy it anyway. Fire safety at the plant sucks. It doesn't matter. Let the plant burn, we'll build a new one in a week. Due to frequent fires, the authorities of Cleveland, which was one of the centers of oil production, just banned the building of plants within the city. But Rockefeller wasn't one of those sniveling businessmen. He felt that oil is the future, so he decided to approach the matter thoroughly. Unlike his partner Maurice Clark, this guy simply bathed in easy money and caught his boxer brother in, who obviously didn't understand a thing about business. For Clark, this oil thing was a financial bubble that was about to burst, so he wanted to make a killing and leave. It drove Rockefeller crazy. As a result, during one of the disputes, he convinced Clark to sell his share at auction, and he bought it himself. Instead of Clark, he partnered with one talented chemist, Samuel Andrews, who is credited with the invention of modern oil distillation technology. I don't know if this is true or not, but Rockefeller's kerosene turned out to be of the highest quality. There was another innovation introduced by Rockefeller at his plant. He made the most waste-free production. While the others were throwing out about 50% of the oil, Rockefeller put everything into action. He started making paraffin, petroleum jelly, fuel oil, and other goodies. He also made sure that his company depended as little as possible on third-party enterprises. Rockefeller laid his own pipelines and even produced his own barrels for oil because he knew crisis was going to happen. And he was right. Uncontrolled oil production led to the fact that the supply of the kerosene market was 3 times higher than the demand. The price of black gold collapsed, and that's when Rockefeller started flourishing. In 1870, he founded his main brainchild, the Standard Oil Company, and the methodical destruction of competitors begins. The destruction is metaphorical. There weren't any arson and gang hits. Due to the low price of oil, many firms went bankrupt, and Rockefeller bought them for almost nothing. With others, he acted more cunningly. Rockefeller recalled his experience as an accountant. You probably remember about the fixed rates for transportation, which can actually be charged. John secretly arranged with a railway cartel for preferential prices for wholesale suppliers. Small enterprises were almost killed, and Rockefeller went on buying up firms. In a year, Standard Oil owned 4% oil production in America. By the way, that was when Rockefeller for the first time got his name on the newspaper pages, but not in a positive way. Journalists found out about his collusion with the railway cartel, and the case went public. The public was outraged, and the discounts had to be cancelled. Though Rockefeller himself didn't understand why everyone was so disturbed. After all, due to these tariffs, he could supply cheaper kerosene. In his opinion, everyone benefited from this. And Rockefeller barely believed in some kind of fair competition. He sincerely believed that the standardization of the entire industry would be a blessing to everyone. Well, of course, he will make money off it, but the others won't be deprived either. And why on earth are those people outraged if they keep using his cheap kerosene and not the fuel from his competitors? So, although Rockefeller was unpleasantly surprised, he didn't refuse his plans. For 4 months of 1972, he bought up almost all the oil production companies in Cleveland. A few years later, this case was accurately called by journalists as the Cleveland Massacre. As a result, even the strongest opponents of Rockefeller were forced to cooperate with him. Moreover, Rockefeller didn't even think to slow down and expanded his company at a frantic pace. So far, oil prices haven't had time to recover, and competitors have not figured out how to resist it. As a result, in just 10 years, Standard Oil's market share increased from 4% to 90. 20,000 wells wells, 6,500 kilometers of pipeline, 5,000 tanks, and more than 100,000 employees. Thus, Rockefeller built the first monopoly in US history, and he wasn't even 40 years old yet. But Rockefeller believed that the idea of his work was not to gobble up as much as possible for himself, but in building an effective business that wouldn't depend on anyone. Therefore, his company grew not only in breadth, but also up. He even had his own retail chain. But the public image of Rockefeller did not get any better from this. Along with other major businessmen of the country, he became a symbol of class inequality in American society. Parents even frightened their children with his name. Well, I must say there was a reason for such discontent. Rockefeller is really hard to call warm and fuzzy. He continued to secretly hustle with oil shipping rates. There was even a moment when Rockefeller thought he could create a company that would own all the oil in the world. But back then, no one knew that there was actually a lot of oil on Earth, and that other countries do have their Rockefellers. I'm not trying to whitewash or discredit Rockefeller. He was an ideal man of his time, moderately progressive and conservative, moderately tough and humane. His business was a benchmark for what America was like in the late 19th century. And now we're approaching the most interesting part. Why did Rockefeller's power over oil keep growing, and why nobody could do anything about it? First, I want to say that in all Russian language videos and articles about Rockefeller, exactly at this point the sequence of events is reversed. That's why Rockefeller looks like an evil incarnate. Like, look what a king he was. Interfered with fair competition, created a monopoly, and everything was for his own good. In fact, there were no antitrust laws back then. That was the time of wild capitalism. If you were outcompeted, then you deserved it. Moreover, no one thought that the entire sector of the economy could be in the hands of one person. Strictly speaking, it was precisely because Rockefeller managed to create a monopoly, and the first antitrust laws appeared. And it happened only in 1890, when Rockefeller had successfully owned all the oil in the USA for 10 years already. And here's another interesting fact for you, which should help you imagine the character of Rockefeller. On the wave of the antitrust cases, Rockefeller fell into a depression and fell ill with nervous alopecia, which caused his hair to fall out. In fact, this is why he looks so creepy in all his later photos. But the first anti-monopoly law was the tip of the iceberg. In fact, no one had any idea how big Rockefeller's business was. For several years, he managed to successfully defend his empire. Due to a bunch of separate entities and rogue firms, it was extremely difficult to understand that nominally different companies belonged to the same person. So everything began to collapse only in 1902. And here we can trace the influence of Rockefeller on history, but now not on economics or politics, but on journalism. It is to him that we owe the birth of the journalistic investigation genre, though Rockefeller himself was barely happy about this. The true magnitude of his business was revealed neither by a government commission nor by prosecutors with the police, but with the help of a simple journalist, Ada Tarbo. She was so cool that a separate video about her can be shot for real. She'd been preparing the material for several years. She rode all over the country in search of information, managed to get into the head office of the Rockefeller Company, blatantly took a few revealing interviews with one of the top managers, and delved through the secret archives. The publication of her articles was a bombshell. Tarbell not only showed the magnitude of Rockefeller's business, but also exposed all the examples of unfair competition. There were bribes and collusion. Even US President Theodore Roosevelt personally joined the fight against Rockefeller. By the way, here's a fun fact. Rockefeller is often called the pure evil, who in the twinkling of an eye could change presidents and regimes in a country in the world, and that he crushed the miserable people like flies not counting. But here's a real-life example for you. When the main brainchild of a businessman was under the threat, he wasn't able to interfere with not only Roosevelt, but with the journalist as well. But it's just an example of the real level of Rockefeller's omnipotence and his desire to harm people at all costs. The trial of Standard Oil lasted for several years, and in 1911 the authorities finally decided that the Rockefeller Company should be liquidated and 34 independent firms created in its place. Rockefeller himself, of course, didn't approve of the court's decision. He continued to believe that a monopoly is a more effective way of managing. But but financially he only benefited. After all, Rockefeller lost control of the company, but not the shares. And as the remnants of his former empire started to compete, the shares boomed, allowing Rockefeller to become the first billionaire in the US history, and then the richest man in modern history. By the end of his life, his fortune totaled $1.4 billion. By today's standards, it's around $418 billion. This amount is about half of Russia's annual budget. But the collapse of the Standard Oil Company happened after his retirement. Rockefeller retired in 1897 at the age of 57, right after he realized he was starting to lose the war on antitrust. However, he did not just go to a country estate to enjoy a successful life. On the contrary, he devoted himself to his second favorite thing: charity. We need another little flashback here. The decision to become a philanthropist was not spontaneous. It's not like the aging oligarch decided to make amends to society by throwing alms to the poor. No, it was nothing like that. Rockefeller began donating from the first day of his work. When we say from the first day, it literally means from the first day. Even when he earned only $16 a month, he still gave alms to beggars. And he'd also been a strongly religious person all his life and regularly donated 10% of his income to churches. First it was hundreds of dollars, then thousands, and then millions. But he started doing it more intensively only after he left the board of directors of Standard Oil and began to invest in education, science, medicine, and art. It's hard even to count how many organizations got help from Rockefeller. 2 universities were open at his expense, in Chicago and New York. Both, by the way, still exist. But even in charity cases, it felt that Rockefeller was a businessman to the core, but not a tender-hearted old lady.
Thank you, sir.
Even giving away millions of dollars on a gratis basis, Rockefeller acted on the principle: if you want to feed the hungry man, give him not a fish, but a fishing rod. And he directly said that he wanted to help those who could continue living without his help. Thanks to the foundation and the Rockefeller University, yellow fever was completely defeated in the Western Hemisphere in just a few decades. By the end of his life, he got so used to being a philanthropist that he gave away $550 million, and Rockefeller's son was almost never involved in the oil business, devoting himself entirely to charity. John Rockefeller died in 1937. Having lived in the world for an incredible 97 years, he not only became a defining figure in the development of capitalism, but also established traditions for future billionaires. It was after him that every big businessman began to consider it's good practice to give a part of his income to charity. So who was Rockefeller? A greedy hustler or a talented entrepreneur who managed to become a role model for many businessmen? Probably both. There are no billionaires without skeletons in the closet, and Rockefeller was far from the worst of them. Good luck.